Well, King Charles was just 16 when he first visited Australia to attend school.
At 2:17 a.m. on December 6th, King Charles sat alone in his private study at Clarence House, unable to sleep, scrolling through security footage his head of protection had compiled after weeks of unexplained leaks about intimate family matters appearing in tabloids with suspicious accuracy. What he discovered in those recordings would shatter his 76-year-old heart in ways that wars, divorces, and his mother's death never had. Frame after frame showed his wife, Queen Camilla, meeting secretly with journalist Michael Henderson in concealed corners of royal properties, passing documents, laughing conspiratorially, and in one devastating clip recorded just 3 days ago, mocking Charles himself as the sentimental fool who never suspected a thing. By 6:43 a.m., security personnel were physically escorting Camilla from Clarence House with orders she was never to set foot on royal property again. The 2 a.m. discovery that ended everything. For weeks, Charles had been unable to sleep, his mind looping around a pattern he could not name but also could not ignore. Private conversations somehow appeared in tabloids within days. Intimate family moments showed up in articles with details only someone present could know, and even sensitive medical information about George's struggles at school surfaced with disturbing accuracy. 3 weeks earlier, uneasy and quietly desperate, he had asked Sir Clive Morrison, his head of security for the past 11 years, to conduct a discreet and comprehensive review of security protocols and examine surveillance from the areas where confidential conversations often took place. On the evening of December 5th, Morrison delivered the findings with a grave expression Charles had never seen on him before, warning him to review the material alone. And now, at 2:17 in the morning, Charles sat in the quiet dark of his study, illuminated only by the glow of his laptop, as the greatest betrayal of his life unfolded in devastating clarity. The first recording, dated August 14, 2023, barely a year after his coronation, showed Camilla slipping out of a side door at Windsor Castle close to midnight, meeting journalist Michael Henderson, a man notorious for brutal royal coverage. Charles watched, numb, as she handed Henderson a folder before accepting something small in return, their body language unsettlingly familiar, relaxed, and practiced. Other clips followed with the same pattern repeating at Balmoral, Clarence House, Sandringham, and Windsor, each meeting arranged with precision, each exchange unmistakably transactional, each encounter confirming that this was a long-standing arrangement, not a momentary lapse. But it was the footage from February 7, 2024, this time with audio, that shattered what remained of his composure. In the recording, Henderson praised the leaked story about William and Catherine's argument, calling it gold, and Camilla, in a clear, confident voice, promised something better: Charles's private journals. She mocked his deepest fears, belittled his reflections on duty, and dismissed his grief for his mother and Diana as pathetic, all while negotiating the monetary value of his most vulnerable thoughts. Charles's hands trembled as he paused the video, realizing she had gone through the journals he had guarded for decades. Banking records Morrison compiled showed offshore accounts in her name containing just over £12 million, each deposit matching major tabloid exclusives. £200,000 after a story about William and Catherine's marital strain during her third pregnancy, £150,000 following an invasive article about Charles's medical concerns, and £90,000 after private details about George's anxieties were exposed. But the revelation that broke him completely came from a deposit of £487,000 linked to leaked letters Diana had written during the final months before their divorce, letters he had cherished for years and believed safe in his private desk. Camilla had stolen them, sold them, and slept beside him every night while doing so. Yet the footage did not end there. A recording from December 3rd, only days earlier, captured Camilla at a London hotel speaking with cold cruelty, calling Charles weak, pathetic, and easily managed. She discussed his mortality as a strategic window for profit, estimating she had 10 or 15 years to extract maximum value before William cut her off. Henderson encouraged her, outlining plans to focus on Charles's decline, his passing, and William's ascension, describing the transition of a monarch's death as worth millions. Charles stopped the video, unable to bear another second of hearing the woman he had loved for more than 50 years plot to monetize his final years. At 4:03 in the morning, he called Morrison back to Clarence House. By 4:47, he had summoned William. By 5:15, Anne had arrived. And by 5:30, after laying out the evidence before them, he made the most painful decision of his reign. Camilla would be removed from Clarence House by dawn, stripped of every title and privilege and banned from all royal residences. There would be no discussion, no last conversation, and no opportunity for her to manipulate him again. At 6:15 in the cold, early light of London, Charles issued the final order to security with a voice hollow from heartbreak. "Remove her from this house, remove her from my life, and let me never see her again." The scope of betrayal uncovered. The investigation that Sir Clive Morrison conducted over 3 weeks, after Charles quietly granted him unrestricted authority, revealed a betrayal so vast and calculated that even the most seasoned security experts were shaken by its depth. Traced communications recovered from devices seized under warrant showed that Camilla's relationship with journalist Michael Henderson had begun in July of 2020, during the first COVID lockdown when the royal family had been isolated at Windsor. Henderson, known for brutal royal reporting since the Diana years, had reached Camilla through intermediaries still under investigation. What began as casual gossip from a bored royal soon evolved into a systematic financial arrangement grounded entirely in betrayal. The earliest messages, restored from encrypted chats, revealed Camilla initially sharing small items of gossip, harmless observations that added color to tabloid stories. But Henderson, well versed in manipulation, slowly increased payments and flattered her insights until she crossed lines she could no longer retreat from. By late 2021, the arrangement had become overtly transactional. Henderson had even created a price list: trivial palace gossip for £5,000 to £10,000, private family tensions for £20,000 to £50,000, medical information for £50,000 to £100,000, and confidential documents for anything above £100,000, depending on sensitivity. When Morrison compiled the full record, the scope staggered even him. Camilla had sold information about William and Catherine's private conversations regarding their timing for having a third child, turning one of their most intimate decisions into a national spectacle that caused Catherine needless distress. She had stolen medical records documenting young George's anxiety issues at school, which led to cruel commentary that left the 9-year-old shaken and confused. Most devastatingly, she had accessed Charles's private journals, leather-bound volumes he had kept since his 20s, containing his fears, regrets, grief, and doubts about his readiness for the throne. Passages he had written in solitude appeared almost verbatim in articles portraying him as weak or emotionally unstable. The deepest wound came from the 14 letters Diana had written to Charles before their divorce, private notes filled with regret, hope, and complex affection. Camilla had taken them from his desk and sold them for £487,000 in June 2024. Their publication, serialized for maximum profit, revived old wounds and used Diana's vulnerability as a weapon against Charles, who never imagined the betrayal came from the woman sharing his life and bed. But Camilla's operation extended far beyond Charles. She had sold information touching nearly every senior royal. She disclosed Anne's private financial concerns at Gatcombe Park, Edward and Sophie's marital strain during 2022, and even details about her own children. The information she provided about Catherine was the most sustained and cruel. 17 tabloid stories were traced directly to her, including disclosures about Catherine's severe pregnancy complications, her adjustment struggles after becoming Princess of Wales, and even private discussions about secondary infertility before conceiving Louis, pain exploited for £200,000. The investigation uncovered a structured network enabling Camilla's spying. 2 palace employees, Mark Reynolds and Jennifer Walsh, were paid monthly sums to grant her after-hours access and disable surveillance when necessary. The most damaging accomplice, Thomas Blackwood from Charles's private office, had been paid £25,000 for each journal entry he photographed. He had provided 40 to 50 pages over 2 years, fueling stories that attacked Charles during some of the most demanding months of his early reign. At the time the investigation concluded, Camilla was negotiating the sale of confidential medical information about one of William's children for £350,000. The transaction was stopped only because Morrison's team had begun active monitoring. Princess Anne's long-held suspicions were grimly confirmed. She had repeatedly warned Charles that Camilla valued status and security above loyalty or love. "Love makes intelligent people catastrophically stupid," she told investigators, unable to take any satisfaction in being right when the cost to her brother was so devastating. But nothing compared to the audio recording from December 3rd. In it, Camilla spoke openly of Charles as weak, pathetic, and emotionally dependent, mocking his journals and claiming she deserved to profit from managing him. She discussed his eventual death as a financial opportunity, calculating how many years she had left to exploit her access before William would shut her out. When Charles played this recording for William and Anne at 5:30 in the morning on December 6th, the decision became unavoidable. There could be no reconciliation, no explanation, no forgiveness. The betrayal was total. The contempt was unmistakable. And the damage to the family, the institution, and Charles's spirit was irreversible. The web of deception and accomplices. The operational mechanisms that had allowed Camilla to sustain 4 years of betrayal without detection revealed a level of planning that stunned even the intelligence professionals brought in to analyze her methods. Though she had no formal training, the security measures she employed reflected deliberate sophistication. She used encrypted messaging applications that wiped conversations automatically, maintained a network of offshore accounts and shell companies to hide payments, and operated multiple secret devices concealed across royal properties. Forensic analysis later uncovered years of incriminating communication stored on those hidden devices. Her exchanges with tabloid journalist Michael Henderson showed coded language designed to obscure their crimes. Family members appeared only as initials or nicknames. Payments were disguised as consulting fees and stolen materials as items. Though constructed with plausible deniability in mind, the volume and consistency of communications ultimately eliminated any possibility of innocence once investigators pieced everything together. Testimony from staff members she'd recruited filled in the remaining operational gaps. Mark Reynolds in Palace Access Control admitted he'd first been approached in July of 2022. Camilla claimed she was researching a book about Queen's consort and needed discreet access to archives. He received £5,000 monthly and believed he was assisting legitimate historical research. By the time he realized she was entering offices containing current family files, he felt trapped, fearful that coming forward would expose his own complicity. Jennifer Walsh, the IT security specialist who disabled cameras and surveillance systems, told a similar story. Camilla approached her in March of 2023 requesting privacy for sensitive therapy sessions. Walsh, believing she was helping someone struggling with mental health pressures, accepted £7,000 monthly to create controlled blind spots in surveillance. She never imagined these gaps were being used to photograph royal documents and meet Henderson. But Thomas Blackwood, stationed in Charles's private office, held no illusions about the nature of his involvement. Offered £25,000 per photographed journal entry, he admitted financial desperation drove him. With 3 children in university, he convinced himself the harm was distant. Over 2 years, he captured 40 to 50 pages of the king's most private reflections. Fears about his reign, grief over Queen Elizabeth, memories of Diana, frustrations with his sons, all of it was sold and transformed into tabloid narratives that wounded Charles during the most vulnerable period of his life. By December 6th, criminal charges were ready for all 3: theft, fraud, conspiracy, and breach of official secrets. Their testimony helped establish the full extent of Camilla's orchestrated operation. Investigators also uncovered how Camilla manipulated personal relationships within the family to gather profitable information. With Catherine, she had positioned herself as a seasoned mentor, encouraging intimate conversations about pregnancy struggles, public pressure, and family planning. These vulnerabilities became material for Henderson, feeding stories that caused Catherine distress during already difficult periods. With William's children, the betrayal was even more disturbing. Playing the affectionate grandmother, she asked about school challenges and emotional struggles. Details about George's anxiety, Charlotte's discomfort with cameras, and Louis's behavioral difficulties became tabloid content, not family confidences. The most chilling revelation emerged from an audio recording dated October 24th. In it, Camilla discussed Charles's mortality as a practical limitation on her earning potential. "I have maybe 10-15 years of this if his health holds," she said, outlining her strategy for value extraction before William became king and cut her off. She complained about the emotional labor of pretending to care for Charles during moments of grief, describing every vulnerability as material to be monetized. Henderson agreed, recommending they prepare to capitalize on the transition between monarchs. A historic event they anticipated would bring millions. This recording, more than any other piece of evidence, was what sealed her fate. When Charles played it for William and Anne at 5:30 a.m. On December 6th, their reactions were immediate and uncompromising. William's fury was icy and controlled. "She's been mining our family for profit while pretending to be one of us. She planned to turn his death into a commodity. That's evil." Anne's response was sharper still. "This is a criminal conspiracy. She should be prosecuted like any other criminal. Wearing a crown makes it worse." By then, Charles felt emotionally numb, too devastated for anger. At 6:15 a.m., he gave the only instruction he felt capable of giving: "Make it happen, all of it. She leaves by dawn, file the charges, release the evidence. The world must see what she did. There must be no doubt." Charles's midnight reckoning. The hours between 2:17 a.m. when Charles began watching the surveillance footage and 6:15 a.m. when he gave the final order for Camilla's removal represented a psychological journey through betrayal so profound that those who witnessed Charles during those hours would later describe watching a man age a decade in a single night. Sir Clive Morrison, who remained with Charles through much of that period to answer questions about the evidence and provide support as needed, later provided testimony in legal proceedings about what he'd observed. "His Majesty cycled through every conceivable emotional response," Morrison stated. Denial, insisting there must be explanations I hadn't considered. Anger, fury at Camilla, at the staff who'd helped her, at himself for being deceived. Bargaining, asking whether there was any interpretation of the evidence that didn't mean complete betrayal. Depression, sitting with his head in his hands for long periods, sometimes weeping quietly. And finally, acceptance, the cold, hard recognition that the woman he'd loved for over 50 years had never truly loved him back, had viewed him primarily as an asset to be exploited rather than a husband to be cherished. The private journals had been the deepest violation for Charles. He'd kept journals since his early 20s, encouraged initially by his father, Prince Philip, as a way to process the unique pressures of royal life and develop perspective on events that would become historically significant. Those journals contained everything he'd never been able to say publicly: his struggles in his marriage to Diana, recognizing it was failing but not knowing how to fix it; his guilt about the divorce and the role his relationship with Camilla had played in destroying his first marriage; his fears about being an adequate king after waiting 70 years for a role he'd been born to but never actually performed; his resentment, carefully hidden but genuinely felt, about waiting so long while his mother reigned into her 90s; his complicated love for both his sons, coupled with painful awareness that William was more naturally suited to kingship than Charles had ever been, that Camilla had read those journals, had stolen passages from them, had sold his most private thoughts for money, felt like a violation of his soul. "I wrote things in those journals I've never told anyone," Charles said to William during their 4:30 a.m. conversation, his voice hollow with pain. "Thoughts I was ashamed of having, fears I couldn't admit even to myself sometimes, resentments about Mummy that I knew were unworthy but felt anyway." And she read all of it and laughed about it with a tabloid journalist and sold it to make me look pathetic to the entire world. She took the most private, vulnerable parts of who I am and turned them into entertainment and profit. William's response had been measured but pointed. "She's been doing that to all of us, Father. Every private conversation, every vulnerable moment, every time any of us trusted her with information we thought was family confidence, she weaponized all of it. The only difference is you married her, which makes the betrayal more personal. But it's not more complete than what she did to Catherine or to my children. She's been systematically exploiting everyone who made the mistake of trusting her. The revelation about Diana's letters had devastated Charles in particularly acute ways. Those 14 letters represented perhaps the only positive remnant of his failed first marriage, evidence that despite everything, he and Diana had maintained some affection and respect at the very end. Reading those letters over the years, usually on anniversaries or during particularly difficult moments, had been a private comfort, a reminder that their relationship hadn't been entirely destructive, that something redeemable had existed between them even after the romantic love had died and the marriage had become untenable. She took the one good thing I had left from that entire nightmare and turned it into tabloid content, Charles had said, his voice breaking. Diana's private words to me, her thoughts she shared in confidence even after the divorce, her vulnerability that she trusted me to protect even when we couldn't protect our marriage. And Camilla stole those letters and sold them for nearly £500,000 while telling me she understood my grief about Diana while pretending to be sympathetic about that entire painful history. What kind of person does that? What kind of monster sells her husband's dead wife's letters for profit? Anne had been present for that particular moment, and her response was characteristically direct but not without compassion. She's the kind of person who views everything and everyone as transactional. She didn't love you, Charles. She loved what you could provide. Status, security, wealth, access. But she didn't love you as a human being. If she did, she couldn't have done this. Love doesn't weaponize vulnerability. Love doesn't sell your partner's pain for profit. What she felt for you, whatever it wasn't love in any sense that word should mean. The recording of Camilla mocking him, calling him pathetic, laughing about manipulating the sentimental fool, had been the moment Charles's lingering hope for some alternative explanation had died completely. Hearing his wife describe him with such contempt, such casual cruelty, had shattered any possibility of misunderstanding or innocent interpretation. This wasn't a woman who'd made mistakes under pressure. This was a woman who fundamentally didn't respect him, who'd spent years performing wifely devotion while privately viewing him with disdain, who'd exploited his love and trust because she correctly assessed he was too emotionally dependent on her to suspect what she was really doing. I've loved her since I was 23 years old, Charles had said to William at some point after 4 a.m., tears streaming down his face unchecked. Before Diana, during Diana, after Diana, she was the constant love of my life. I waited for her for decades. I fought for her against my parents' wishes, against public opinion, against everyone who said we shouldn't be together. I endured years of being called an adulterer, of being blamed for Diana's unhappiness, of being second choice to my own mother in popularity, all of it bearable because I had Camilla. And she thinks I'm pathetic. She's been laughing about me to a journalist, discussing my death as a business opportunity, planning to profit from documenting my decline and final days. How could I have been so completely wrong about someone for 50 years? William had no answer to that question, could only sit with his father in the pre-dawn darkness and witness grief too vast for words. By 5:45 a.m., as the December sky began showing the first hints of light, Charles had processed through his emotional devastation to something harder and colder. He'd made his final decisions. Camilla would be removed from Clarence House immediately, banned from all royal properties permanently, stripped of every title and privilege. Criminal charges would be filed. Evidence would be released publicly to prevent any narrative that this was overreaction or persecution. And Charles would never see her again, never speak to her again, never allow her the opportunity to manipulate him one more time with whatever charm or explanation she might attempt. At 6:15 a.m., Charles had given the order that would end his marriage and close the chapter on the great love story he'd believed he was living for half a century. "Remove her from this house," he'd told Morrison with a voice that was steady despite the devastation behind it. "Remove her from my life. I never want to see her again. She chose money over loyalty, exploitation over love, profit over family. And I choose the institution over someone who's proven she has no loyalty to offer, no love worth having. By tonight, I want this done. By tomorrow, I want it public. And by next week, I want her facing criminal charges like any other person who's committed theft, fraud, and betrayal of trust. The fact that she wore a crown while doing it makes her crimes worse, not better. She'll face consequences, and I'll face the rest of my reign knowing that 50 years of my life was spent loving someone who viewed me primarily as a meal ticket she was smart enough to milk for everything it was worth. The Dawn removal and immediate fallout. The removal of Camilla from Clarence House at 6:23 a.m. on December 6th was witnessed by multiple staff members who would later describe it as one of the most shocking and surreal scenes they'd experienced in decades of royal service. A queen consort being escorted from royal property like a common criminal, while household staff who'd served her watched in stunned silence. Sir Clive Morrison personally led the security team that entered Camilla's private bedroom suite at precisely 6:23 a.m., accompanied by 2 senior palace officials and a legal representative. Camilla had been asleep, apparently unaware that evidence against her had been compiled and that Charles had spent the night reviewing her years of betrayals. Morrison had been the one to wake her and deliver the news that would end her life as she'd known it. "Ma'am, His Majesty has directed that you are to leave Clarence House immediately and permanently," Morrison had stated, his voice professional but carrying an undertone of barely restrained disgust. "You are no longer welcome on any royal property. Your belongings will be packed and delivered to you at a location of your choosing within 48 hours. You have 30 minutes to dress and gather essential personal items. Security will escort you from the premises. There will be no discussion. There will be no contact with His Majesty." Those are his explicit instructions. Camilla's response, according to those present, had been shock followed by immediate calculation. She'd apparently understood instantly that something catastrophic had occurred, had asked what this was about, had been told simply that evidence of her activities had been discovered and that there would be no negotiation. When she demanded to speak to Charles, she'd been informed coldly that His Majesty had no wish to see or speak to her now or ever. The finality of that statement had apparently penetrated even Camilla's initial shock, and witnesses reported her face going pale as the reality of her situation became clear. The 30 minutes that followed were described by staff as tense and surreal. Camilla dressed quickly, her hands visibly shaking, making several phone calls that security allowed but monitored. She tried calling her children, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes. She tried calling her lawyer. And notably, she tried calling Michael Henderson, though that particular call was blocked and the attempt noted as additional evidence of her relationship with the journalist who'd been paying her for family secrets. Her belongings, she was informed, would be packed by palace staff and delivered within 2 days to whatever address she provided. She was permitted to take only what she could carry personally. The crown jewels she'd worn during coronation, the official regalia of Queen Consort, all of it would remain as property of the crown. Personal jewelry she'd brought into the marriage could be claimed later through legal representatives, but she was leaving Clarence House with essentially nothing but the clothes she'd put on and whatever small personal items she could fit into a single bag. At 6:53 a.m., Camilla was escorted from Clarence House through a service entrance, the same entrance where security cameras had captured her meeting Henderson in August 2023. She was placed in an unmarked vehicle with security personnel and driven to a hotel in central London that had been hastily arranged to house her temporarily while she determined her next moves. Staff reported she was crying during the escort to the vehicle. Whether from genuine emotion or calculated performance, none could say, but the tears didn't generate sympathy from anyone present who knew what she'd done. By 7:30 a.m., palace officials had delivered formal notifications to Downing Street that Queen Consort Camilla had been removed from royal properties and that His Majesty would be requesting emergency action regarding her titles. By 8 a.m., palace lawyers had filed multiple legal actions, restraining orders preventing Camilla from accessing royal properties, freezing of offshore accounts that had received Henderson's payments, and formal criminal referrals to law enforcement for investigation into theft, fraud, breach of official secrets, and conspiracy to commit various offenses. The public statement released at 8:17 a.m. was unprecedented in its directness and severity. Following discovery of serious misconduct involving systematic sale of private royal family information to media organizations over a period exceeding 4 years, His Majesty has ordered the immediate removal of Camilla Parker Bowles from all royal properties. Evidence obtained through lawful investigation demonstrates years of deliberate betrayal of family confidence for financial gain, including theft of private documents, sale of confidential information, and conspiracy with media figures to exploit royal family vulnerabilities. All titles and privileges granted upon marriage are being withdrawn through emergency legal processes. Criminal investigations are underway by appropriate authorities. His Majesty will make no further comment on this deeply personal betrayal beyond noting that the evidence is overwhelming and the actions taken are both legally necessary and morally imperative. The international reaction was instantaneous and overwhelming. Within minutes, every news organization globally had interrupted programming. Within an hour, Camilla was trending worldwide with over 8 million mentions. Within 2 hours, British television had devoted complete coverage to what was being called the most dramatic royal scandal in modern history, surpassing even the Charles and Diana divorce in its combination of personal betrayal, criminal conduct, and institutional crisis. Prince William's statement, released through Kensington Palace at 9:42 a.m., carried barely contained fury. The Princess of Wales and I have learned that information we shared in confidence with someone we trusted as family was systematically sold to tabloids for years. Our children's private struggles were exploited for money. My grandmother's letters, my mother's memory, my father's private grief, all of it turned into commodities by someone who wore a crown while betraying every principle that crown should represent. We support His Majesty's decision completely and have been assured this individual will never have access to our family again. This is not about mistakes or misunderstandings. This is about calculated, sustained criminal betrayal for profit, and it will be prosecuted accordingly. Princess Anne's statement was characteristically blunt and unforgiving. I warned against this marriage from the beginning, not from personal animosity but from assessment of character. That assessment has proven tragically accurate. The institution has been damaged by someone who was welcomed into it and chose to exploit that welcome for financial gain. But the monarchy has survived worse threats than one person's greed and betrayal. My brother has my complete support as he deals with this personally devastating situation and takes the necessary institutional actions to protect the crown from further damage. Public reaction in the UK was complex and divided. Older citizens who remembered Charles's long relationship with Camilla and her rehabilitation after the Diana years expressed shock mixed with sympathy for the king. Many felt betrayed themselves, having been convinced by years of positive coverage to accept Camilla as worthy queen consort, only to learn she'd been systematically selling royal secrets for profit the entire time. Younger demographics focused more on the violation of Catherine and the children's privacy, expressing particular outrage that a grandmother figure had exploited young children's struggles for money. Michael Henderson was arrested at 11:30 a.m. at his London residence, charged with conspiracy to commit theft, handling stolen property, and multiple violations of communications privacy law. His computers and phones were seized, providing additional evidence of the full scope of his relationship with Camilla and documentation of exactly what he'd paid for specific pieces of information over 4 years. His employer, initially standing by their journalist in the first hour after the story broke, quickly reversed position once the palace began releasing evidence, suspending Henderson and distancing themselves from his conduct. The 3 palace staff members who'd assisted Camilla were also arrested, facing charges of theft, fraud, breach of official secrets, and conspiracy. Their testimony, provided in exchange for potential sentencing considerations, filled in operational details, and provided additional evidence against Camilla herself. Thomas Blackwood's admission that he'd been paid £25,000 per journal entry he photographed was particularly damaging. making clear this had been an organized criminal conspiracy rather than isolated poor judgment. By mid-afternoon, the palace began releasing selected evidence to justify the dramatic action and prevent any narrative that this was institutional overreaction or persecution. Audio recordings of Camilla discussing Charles as pathetic and planning to profit from his death. The reckoning and permanent exile. The weeks following Camilla's removal on December 6th witnessed criminal proceedings that would likely extend for years. A public reckoning with how someone at the highest levels of the monarchy had systematically betrayed the institution for profit, and Charles's grim acceptance that 50 years of his life had been spent loving someone who'd never truly loved him back. The criminal investigation moved quickly given the overwhelming nature of the evidence. By December 10th, formal charges had been filed against Camilla Parker Bowles, as she was now referred to in all official documents rather than by any royal titles. The charges included theft of private documents, fraud, conspiracy to violate Official Secrets Acts, and receiving criminal property, namely payments from Henderson in exchange for stolen information. If convicted on all counts, she faced potentially decades in prison, though legal experts suggested plea bargains were more likely given her age and the complexity of prosecuting someone who'd held such a high position. Michael Henderson faced parallel charges and was denied bail due to flight risk and the ongoing nature of the conspiracy. His seized devices revealed the full scope of the operation, showing that over 4 years he'd paid Camilla a total of just over £11 million for information that had generated substantially more in increased tabloid circulation and advertising revenue. The business model had been extraordinarily profitable for both parties, and only the palace investigation had ended what would likely have continued until Charles's death provided the ultimate story Camilla and Henderson had discussed exploiting. The palace staff members who'd assisted Camilla accepted plea agreements in exchange for their testimony against her. Their cooperation provided detailed evidence about operational methods, specific documents that had been stolen, and Camilla's explicit instructions about what information she wanted accessed. Thomas Blackwood's testimony was particularly damaging, including descriptions of Camilla reviewing journal entry photographs and essentially shopping them to Henderson with assessments of which passages would be most commercially valuable based on their emotional content and potential to embarrass Charles. Public reaction continued evolving as more evidence was released and the full scope of the betrayal became clear. Initial shock gave way to more complex responses. Some expressed sympathy for Charles as a victim of the ultimate betrayal by someone he'd loved for 50 years. Others questioned how he could have been so completely deceived for so long, suggesting either willful blindness or negligence in noticing what should have been warning signs. A smaller but vocal group argued that the monarchy itself was so dysfunctional that it created conditions where even insiders felt justified in exploiting it for profit. Both had careers and families that were now overshadowed by their mother's crimes. Both faced years of being questioned about what they'd known, whether they'd suspected, whether they'd benefited from their mother's illegal income. Both were essentially estranged from their mother while simultaneously defending her humanity to some degree in public statements, a balancing act that satisfied no one and reflected their genuinely impossible position. The evidence releases continued through December as the palace determined that complete transparency was necessary to prevent conspiracy theories or sympathetic revisionism about Camilla's conduct. The most damaging releases were audio recordings where Camilla's voice was clearly identifiable, discussing Charles with contempt, mocking his emotional needs, and planning to exploit his eventual death. These recordings destroyed any remaining public sympathy for her and made clear this hadn't been about financial necessity or pressure, but about greed and fundamental lack of respect for the man she'd married. By December 20th, 2 weeks after the initial revelation, the immediate crisis had settled into long-term legal proceedings and institutional adjustments. Official succession documents had been updated to remove any reference to Camilla as Queen Consort. Royal websites had been scrubbed of her image and references. The coronation itself was being retroactively reframed in official histories to minimize her role and focus on Charles's assumption of duties. It was as though the palace was trying to erase her from history, to make her tenure as queen consort as invisible as possible, given that it had lasted less than 2 years between the coronation in May 2023 and her removal in December 2024. The long-term implications would take years to fully understand. Charles faced the remainder of his reign knowing that the woman he'd elevated to queen consort had betrayed him and the institution systematically for profit. The monarchy had been damaged by demonstration that even at its highest levels, people could be motivated by greed rather than duty. And the entire concept of rehabilitation, the idea that someone who'd been publicly vilified could win acceptance through sustained good behavior, had been undermined by proof that Camilla's rehabilitation had been performance concealing ongoing betrayal. For Charles personally, the reckoning was ongoing and perhaps would never fully complete. He'd loved Camilla since 1970, had fought for her against family pressure and public opinion, had endured being called an adulterer and being blamed for Diana's unhappiness, had waited decades to finally marry her and make her his queen. Every memory of those years was now tainted by knowledge that she'd never loved him the way he'd loved her, that she'd viewed the relationship primarily as a path to status and financial opportunity, that she'd actively held him in contempt while performing wifely devotion. The saddest aspect, noted by psychologists who analyzed the situation, was that Charles would likely never be able to trust romantic love again. At 76 years old, facing the remainder of his reign alone, he'd been so thoroughly betrayed by someone he'd trusted completely that rebuilding capacity for that kind of trust seemed impossible. He'd been deceived not for months or years, but for decades, and that level of sustained deception destroys something fundamental in a person's ability to believe in the authenticity of others' expressed feelings. As the year ended and 2025 began, Charles moved forward with his duties, maintained his schedule, and fulfilled his constitutional obligations. But those close to him reported a king who'd been fundamentally altered by December 6th, who moved through his role with discipline, but without the engagement and passion that had once characterized his approach to monarchy. He'd lost not just his wife, but his faith in his own judgment, his understanding of his life story, and his belief that the love he'd spent 50 years fighting for had ever been real or reciprocated. The monarchy would survive, it always did. Institutions endure even when the individuals within them are damaged or destroyed. But Charles himself might never fully recover from the discovery that his life's great love story had been, from his partner's perspective, primarily a long-term business arrangement she'd been smart enough to monetize in ways he'd never suspected until the evidence became impossible to deny. That knowledge, that fundamental betrayal, would shadow the remainder of his reign and define his personal legacy in ways that no amount of constitutional duty or institutional service could fully overcome.